and thank you very much for the talk that you gave, and hopefully I will be expanding on some of the points you made earlier. So this is what I'm going to cover. I've given a fair few talks about ontologies over the years, and one feature of them is that they were often aimed at people who were really dealing with ontologies all of the time, so they were very familiar with them. And this meant that they didn't really have a helpful definition of what an ontology was, and I realise that not all of you may be familiar with what ontologies even are. What are they for? We've seen examples given by Sammy, but this is of course a standalone talk which people may be watching on YouTube. What we have done at the RSC and where now. So a hopefully uncontroversial definition of the computer science sort of ontology is that it's an account aimed at machines of what things there are, hopefully in a specific limited domain to make the task easier, and what relations necessarily hold between those things. That sounds very technical, so I'll expand with a few simple examples. Basically what they do is they tell machines what is true by definition. And it's generally good if you have an ontology where the content is tautologous, trivial, pedantic, obvious, because what's obvious to us as embodied language using mammals is very far from obvious to a machine. So to take a very tautologous case, I'm going to assume that it's summer and you are sitting on the grass and you are making a daisy chain. There's actually a lot going on there. Daisy chains are sorts of chain. They're not, as far as I know, naturally occurring. If you find one in real life, that's because somebody has been sticking them together. It's also true, as the name suggests, that daisy chains are made up of daisies. In fact, we can go further. For reasoning purposes, we can say that all daisy chains have as a part some daisy. It's not true, however, in reverse. This is a mistake that you sometimes see in ontologies, where they use a relation that goes in the opposite direction. I think the vast majority of daisies in this country, at least, go through their short lives without ever becoming part of a daisy chain. It's also true that every daisy chaining process has as its input a daisy. And it's also true that most daisies do not end up in a daisy chain. So there's a small chunk of a purely hypothetical ontology so far. We can also talk about parthoods. We can talk about plant anatomy. So daisies have leaves and petals to rise at certain parts of their lives. And the daisy chaining process itself has parts. There's making wee nicks in the stem of the daisy and threading, and this is repeated. Now imagine that you're sitting on the grass and you are a very organized sort of person who likes to keep notes of what you're doing. In that case, you might end up giving your daisy chains stable identifiers that you might want to use on photographs or for speaking about them later. You can say that this given daisy chain originated from a particular daisy chain process. You could add a start time and end time to that, and geodata, where did you do it? And you could even identify the daisies that were involved. So whereas in the previous slide we only had, going vertically, is-a relations, where every daisy chain is some kind of chain, every Alice perennis is a eudicot, and so on. These are instances of relations that connect something that exists in the real world to the class, to the identity. And you'll see why this is important in a moment. And one example I did think about, but decided was way too complicated despite it being topical, is snowmen. So there's some examples showing the diversity of snowmen and how that certainly wouldn't fit onto a single slide. You will also have come across the word ontology just in your general reading and listening to the radio, and it has all sorts of meanings from philosophy where the term originated. So I'm not going to read those out. These are just for future reference. So what are they for? Sammy has dealt with this already, but I'll give my own take on it based on my own experience. They provide stable identifiers for classes of thing that can be used for indexing or for integrating different sorts of data. Now, one of the key scientific ontologies that's really quite old now, the first paper was published in 2000, was the gene ontology, which is for integrating genomics data, because the fly people and the mouse people were often talking about the same sort of phenomena going on inside their organisms, but they were using different language to talk about it. So an opaque identifier where you just have letters and numbers that don't actually mean anything in English was very useful for this. One thing I haven't shown so far is that an ontology will generally have human readable definitions for what it's talking about. Not always, often in computer, sometimes in computer science, these are absent. Another thing that's quite big in the life science ontologies is that they have big collections of synonyms, because, as you will know, people speak about the same things in different ways. They are also used in linked data projects. I'm not going to talk about them too much. And into graph databases. If you see in the life sciences context, in pharma, for example, people talking about graph databases, there's almost certainly ontologies in there powering what's going on. And one thing that's been quite fashionable recently has been people talking about AI readiness. They can help with making sure that your data is clean. I'm not going to say true, I'm just going to say clean. Now, Wikidata, a very large database that is one of the Wikimedia projects, is not intended to be an ontology, but it uses a lot of the same technology and has a number of the same characteristics. One general property when you're constructing an ontology is that you will have lots and lots of, you will have the number of entities that's appropriate for the number of things you're talking about. But in order to help with classification and reasoning and tidying things up, it's a good idea to have as few properties as you can manage. So those arrows in the daisy chain diagram, there should be as few types of arrow as you need. And this proves, in fact, to be mirrored in the official process. You can create a Wikidata entity just by going on the website, by creating a page on a wiki. However, if you want to create a property, this could be a property like having a date of birth, having an identifier. Say, for example, the compositions have a Mozart, have an opus number, but also there are famous catalogues, for generally on a per composer basis, where everything has a number specific to that composer. So That's the other kind of property that you have inside Wikidata. And they have constraints as well. Sammy mentioned Sparkle, which is a query language, something like SQL for relational databases, but for the semantic web, which drives the following. If you add a date of birth to an entry in Wikipedia, then a wee flag will pop up, unless the entry has the right sort of metadata associated with it. So if you want to give somebody a date or place of birth, you have to make sure that they're an instance of a human being. The other example from the documentation is that if you are giving something the color #FFFF for bright white, if you're giving something that color specification, then it should actually be a color. Again, this doesn't force things to be true, but it does prevent colors having a place of birth, for example. To give an example of just how much there is on Wikidata, I'm on Wikidata. I had nothing to do with this. This was, I popped up because I have been imported along with various papers that I have written. I'm not going to show you all of the statements associated with me. I don't actually have date or place of birth on there, but I am a human. Sadly, they haven't given any evidence of that. Another example, and this is something where what sounds like an academic exercise is actually impinging on websites that people use all the time. It's given by the Catalan Wikipedia. This is ILI, where I live, and most of the article in Catalan Wikipedia about ILI has been written by many people. They have typed away facts about ILI in Catalan. However, there is also an info box which has a picture of the cathedral and the railway bridge, fortunately not one that gets all the collision traffic. And that picture is drawn from Wikidata, and there are various facts also drawn from Wikidata. There's a population. It says that it is bathed or watered by the Great Ooze. That is true. It's especially watered by the Great Ooze just now, and it has other things like postcodes and telephone prefixes. And you can go on to Wikidata and edit those should they change. For example, if somebody renames the Great Ooze, possibly after some hydrological disaster. A much more ambitious example is using Wikidata for natural language generation. This is a kind of reverse text mining, where the article about the fly agaric toadstool, the most iconic toadstool to my mind, has a paragraph that has been entirely generated from one template. It says fungi, disgrifiad, fungi, brackets description, which calls out other templates. There's one for the color, there's one for the cap, there's one for the high medium, and there's one for the way that the fungus feeds itself. And there's a bit of sleight of hand here, because Welsh natural language generation is quite tricky because of the way that the grammar changes how things are spelled. But there's a perfectly natural sort of Welsh on the left there that has been generated purely from templates and the data in Wikidata. So moving from something that isn't intended as an ontology as such and is of completely general application, let's move over to chemistry and let's talk about some things that are actually intended as ontologies and these sort of things that we've put to use for. I'm going to talk about two projects. There's project prospect, which is how I got into it in the first place, and there was a later project, Open Facts. Now, I'm pleased to see Richard Kidd, who was my manager at the time of this project, is one of the listeners on the talk. So the idea behind this was that it was an experiment in the semantic annotation of chemistry articles, and this came out of a collaboration with the University of Cambridge, where basically we would supply them with text to play with, and they would supply technology, and we got rather more involved with this than some of the other participants, and we used a combination of manual annotation and also Cambridge's text finding tools. The outputs from this were enhanced HTML. This was where entities in the HTML were highlighted if they were particularly thought to be of interest or in need of a definition. RSS feeds, because this was 2006, and also new ontologies, which I'll come to, and contributions to existing ontologies, such as the gene ontology. And how did we evaluate this? Well, it was a mixture of things. It was there was a hypothesis that it would drive usage of the HTML, and the results were somewhat mixed on that. It's partly on a broader definition of impact. I mean, the very fact that I'm speaking to you now is an example of the sort of impact that it had. Now, why was it even considered possible? Well, because there's a very long-standing literature in indexing and searching chemical structures. There's also a long-standing literature in using systematic chemical names to extract these structures. And one of the tools that my now colleague, Peter Corbett at the Royal Society of Chemistry, developed initially, it's been later developed by Daniel Lowe, was Opsyn, which has a grammar for chemical names, which it relates to a structure. Another way that we can extract chemical structures from what authors supply is from ChemDraw files, which might look a bit horrifyingly binary if you're used to such formats as XML and JSON and rather more human readable ones, but turns out to be very well documented. And it only takes a few afternoons to write code that can extract a chemical structure from ChemDraw file. However, authors are endlessly creative in the way they draw things, and it would probably take a lifetime to deal with all the variations that they can come up with, and some of the abuses that they do to the format. It won't have escaped your notice, though, the chemistry papers talk about more than just chemical structures. Here is an abstract that I pulled out of our organic chemistry journal this morning. You can see it's very, very dense. It's very text heavy. One thing that's quite noticeable is that in terms of things that you can draw a completely specified chemical structure for, the sort of thing that you would give an InChI to, in the abstract itself, as opposed to the article as a whole, there is only elemental iodine, I2, but there's lots of other things of chemical interest in there that would be useful for annotating and indexing. There's various sorts of salts. There's the substructure, the iodo-benzoimidazolium substructure, and if you ever did organic chemistry as an undergraduate, you will remember name reactions, which are a bit like chess openings, where there is a particular way of making things happen in the lab, which has been named by some sort of worthy, named after some sort of worthy in the past. And here's an example of the Japanese metal catalyzed reactions, which won Nobel Prizes when I was growing up. So what resources were there? Sally mentioned some of these. Because I work for a publisher, a chemistry publisher, one of my first thoughts was the IUPAC colour books, where the great and the good sit together and decide on standards for humans to read. So it's all text, and these are they. The IUPAC Red Book is very much not an ontology. It's a recipe for naming inorganic and organometallic compounds. Something that's almost an ontology is the IUPAC Gold Book. Now, this actually has definitions for the things that it talks about in a form that is very, very that's very close to the sort of thing that you have in an ontology. It's called an Aristotelian definition, where you say a phototransistor is a specific sort of bipolar transistor, and then it says what makes that different from other bipolar transistors. And it's also available in XML and JSON. Now, what we found about this was that it was too general and covered all of chemistry. We really wanted to focus on some rather more specific things. There's also a pre-existing chemical ontology developed by our close neighbours at the EBI as a spin-off from the gene ontology, because the gene ontology needed to talk about small molecules. They're an important part of biology, and how enzymes interact with them and what they do inside biology. So this contains small molecules. It gives InChIs and spars for them. It also very usefully gives classes of small molecule. So things like if something is an ester, or if something is a substituted pyrazole or a substituted imidazole, all that sort of thing. It also mentions subatomic particles, less obviously relevant. It mentions parts of small molecules, such as, for example, imidazolium rings. Also, often people in articles talk about where a reaction happens in the molecule. It talks about biological roles, and it talks about applications as well. And it's online there. So I'll cover two that we developed at the RSC. The first one is the chemical methods ontology, and the second one is the named reaction ontology. The chemical methods ontology was really filling a gap in analytical chemistry and physical chemistry, where people have machines which do particular experiments and have particular output. So the simplest ones are those that collect data. So you have mass spectrometry, for example. You use a mass spectrometer to do mass spectrometry on a sample, and that produces a mass spectrum. All of this is trivial and pedantic. It's not obvious to a computer. It also describes methods for preparation and separation, chromatography, for example. And one thing that's quite big in analytical chemistry is you have hyphenated methods, where you stick the output of one machine onto the input of another machine. And these can be quite long, shall we say. There's you get various sorts of chromatography leading into ionization, leading into mass spectrometry, and the ontology can describe all of these. And there's also methods used for synthesizing materials, which has been a growing part of our chemistry output. So the methodology was find volunteers among the technical editors, take the IUPAC Orange Book that has some definitions, some human readable definitions for techniques, not arranged in the hierarchy. We also had a technique classification from Analytical Abstracts, one of our abstracting products. These were combined. Technical editors used Excel to gather things, I used Perl because it was 2006 and we didn't really have Python in those to convert it to oboe format. That's a somewhat more human readable way of representing ontologies that's compatible, that's round trippable to OWL, which Sammy mentioned. And there was a program OboEdit that we used for validation and visualization. This is what one of the entries looks like in Protégé, which is a more recent, which is a longer standing and also still maintained ontology editor. That's for pulsed NMR, which is the kind of NMR that you come across in real life most of the time, because it's no longer the 1950s. It contains in rather small lettering there a human readable definition, and it contains various synonyms, various ways that that technique is mentioned when it's in text. And a rather more challenging one is the name reaction ontology. This is going back to those reactions that are called things like Mukayama and Kanetsaro and Diels Alder, Hayosh Parish, Eder, and all of those which may be giving you flashbacks if you were an undergraduate chemist. So I took two of my technical editor colleagues. We took a big pile of name reactions from one of the books. It might have been March, and what we looked at various ways of organizing them. So a good ontological practice is that you have a principal axis of classification. You decide you decide how to decide what an entity's parent is, and then what differentiates its siblings. In this case, for reasons I'll come to, it was the objective of the reaction. What is the chemist trying to do in the lab? We made a flowchart, and then we refined. And then we had meetings where we refined this flowchart, looking at reactions 100 at a time. So why was intent important? Something that did occur to us initially was mechanisms. Partly because that's how reactions are taught if you're an undergraduate. The problem with this is that as more data emerges, people get a clearer view of how reactions actually take place, what the mechanisms are, and they can also be sensitive to reaction conditions as well. So you end up pushing the arrows in a completely different way around the molecules in order to get the result. Also, the aim is to complement reaction cheminformatics. It's a known thing. So if people are using reaction fingerprints to classify their reactions, there's no point in redoing that. And indeed, these days you get reaction embeddings. So we have a classification based on what is the chemist trying to do, and this involves looking at what the reactants are, looking at what the product is, and looking for what the difference between the two is. And there is a big flow chart here. I'm not going to read this. You can enjoy this at your leisure later with the top level terms. And this has been very robust. And though I've been on and off adding dozens of extra categories, many suggested by Roger Sale and colleagues, everything seems to fit into this big flowchart, and it hasn't needed to be redesigned. What does the ontology look like? One thing that is used a lot in undergraduate teaching, but not in real life, is the Diels-Alder reaction. It's one that I could remember from being an undergraduate because it forms a six-membered ring, and six-membered rings are stable. The textual part of that is shown on the left in oboe format. We have an ID, we have a name, we have human readable definition, we have the ORCID ID of the contributor. We have some synonyms, and we have cross references we have cross-reference to Wikidata, and we have that it is a 4+2 cycloaddition, and that it is also a ring formation. And I've shown on the right a diagram somewhat similar to the daisy chain diagram earlier, showing that the Diels-Alder reaction is, if you like, in the center of a web. There's less specific processes that it's an example of, and there's more specific things that are also Diels-Alder reactions. And actually, when you're taught about that at university, I think it was a homo Diels-Alder reaction, where everything all around the ring is a carbon atom, and there's other varieties like an Aza Diels-Alder reaction as well. And this is an example of how we reused other ontologies. Things like cyclohexene and cyclic compound are brought in from Kebi, and the very top level terms, planned process and process, are brought in from OB and UFO, which are open biomedical ontologies. And indeed, we try and reuse the relations given by those ontologies wherever possible. We did create some specific relations for the ontology. It's obvious to a human being that a protection reaction is because you are protecting something with you're protecting a given group with a particular protecting group. Deprotection is another example of these, and then throughout the ontology we specify products, reactants, catalysts, and where relevant, intermediates. And as part of the workings of the ontology for reasoning purposes, there's an achieved planned objective. That's a sort of advanced topic that I'm not going to spend too much time on. So what did we produce from this? There is an open source ontology, which you will see the URL for later on, and there's now over 600 classes. They all have human readable definitions for reasons I dealt with in my previous AI3SD talk 11 months ago. There are not as many machine readable definitions as would be ideal for due partly to the limitations of the language we use. Outcomes, they're on Wikidata. They appear in Wikipedia info boxes. They are used as identifiers in addition to the identifiers in name RxM, a commercial product that takes chemical reactions and assigns and identifies what name they have, what kind of reaction they are. And there's anecdotal evidence of use in big pharma companies. And very briefly, I will take a sort of big data project that we were involved with and contributed to. So the idea for this was that it was public-private partnership, many partners shown on the right, to produce a user-friendly, full-featured interface for interrogating integrated biological and chemical data for drug discovery. And this was very much using the semantic web, the ontology infrastructure that we've seen before. And what we were providing was cheminformatics calculations for molecules in Chembl. Chembl contained the actual lab data. We had hypothetical, we had computations about them, and I'll show what. So this used cheminf, a cheminformatics ontology that I haven't mentioned so far because we don't publish a lot of cheminformatics. And what the output was, absolutely enormous files, billions of lines for systems in industry. And we also expanded the cheminf ontology where there were gaps. This is what the data model looks like for something that sounded very simple, where you said, we want to know what the log P of benzene is. Now, if you were just going around creating relationships, creating properties willy-nilly, then you would just say benzene has log P 2.17. But there's all sorts of other things you want to capture about that, like the uncertainty, like what the units are, how you got from benzene to 2.17. So this is one of the reasons why the files were so big, because even something as simple as that doesn't have a simple representation when you have to explain yourself properly. So the results, in terms of the big result, was it actually worked, which was a bit of a surprise. We took millions of compounds and managed to produce billions of lines of RDF that describes what was going on. In terms of broader outcomes, these are harder to assess and largely anecdotal. So, having covered these two things, where next? We're not involved in any projects at the moment that actively make significant use of ontologies. However, they are out there. They are open source. You can take them away. You can do what you will. If you do use them, and if you identify gaps, we would really welcome if you let us know. And GitHub provides an infrastructure for doing this, where there's an issue tracker, and if you are proficient, you can put in a pull request. We no longer host the ontologies in a browsable way on our website, but they are available, for example, from the EBI's ontology lookup service, and wherever you get your Obo Foundry ontologies. So, in conclusion, what are ontologies for? They are for stating what is obvious to you and me, and far from obvious to machines. That you can use them to make the data you have, if it's the right sort of data. Sammy mentioned that they're not so good at numerical data. You can make it AI ready. You can clean it and avoid the worst sorts of nonsense. You can use them for both text mining and extracting information from text, and then using different information to create new text, as we demonstrated. And there are chemistry-specific ontologies, a number of which we've developed at the RSC. And if they are relevant to you, please let us know. So, thank you for listening. I'd be delighted to hear whether you have any questions.